Hello everyone, this is Lydia Burgess-Gamble from the Environment Agency, and I'm very pleased to be able to speak to you about a project which we've recently published on the costs and impacts of the winter 13-14 floods. In the top right hand corner, that's a picture of me, and the reason there's a picture of me and my dog is that I'm working at home in order to have better sound quality for this telecom, but you may hear a bit of interaction from my dog who gets interested in flood risk teleconferences. So I'll just give you a bit of an update on who I am and the background behind this project, and then I'll take you through some of the main findings from this study. So this project was undertaken last year, and it was undertaken by our lead contractors, Teresa Fenn from RPA, with subcontractors from Royal Haskelling's DHV, Joe Morris from Cranfield University, and John Chatterton from the Flood Hazard Research Centre. I was the main project manager for the Environment Agency, and I work in a team which delivers flood risk research for the DEFRA Environment Agency Joint Flood Risk Research Programme. So DEFRA and the Environment Agency undertake research, and we have a programme called a joint programme through which we deliver this research. It's research that we undertake for England and Wales, and it's for all flood risk management authorities. And this particular project came about after the winter 13-14 floods. So what was the purpose of this study? Well, the main purpose of this study was to calculate the impacts and the economic damages which resulted from the winter 13-14 floods in England and in Wales. And it was building on some past research that we've undertaken. So back in 2007, after the 2007 floods, we undertook a cost estimate to understand the economic impacts of those floods in England and Wales. And that research has underpinned many other tools that we use for making investment decisions, such as the multicoloured manual. And it was deemed that it was about time that we updated our knowledge behind flood cost estimates and looked at the impacts of these recent floods. So we not only wanted to understand the overall cost of these floods to the economy, but we also wanted to be able to update our existing investment tools so that they were current. And we wanted to fill some research gaps that weren't covered by the 2007 flood cost estimate. So the 2007 flood cost estimate had been particularly focused on fluvial flooding, and it differed quite significantly from the floods that we witnessed in 13-14. For example, it didn't cover coastal erosion, and it didn't really look at the long duration type floods that we witnessed in these recent flood events. We also wanted to look in detail at the impacts on transport and utilities, which was quite substantial in these recent floods, and to understand the impacts of flooding on agriculture. So this study has recently been published, and it's now being used to inform cost estimates for the floods that we've just witnessed this winter. So it's really current that we should be talking about this, and it offers many tools that we can use in the future for flood cost estimates. So before I go in detail and look at what we did, I just wanted to touch on the difference between financial and economic flood cost estimates. So for this study, we undertook an economic cost estimate, and that's substantially different than the financial damage estimates, in that we use economic damage estimates for national scale cost estimates, which looks at the costs of the flood damage to the economy as a whole. It can include financial costs, but these are usually adjusted. This means removing taxes, subsidies and money spent on betterment. And economic damages are generally lower than financial costs. Financial damages are usually the damages that are incurred by individuals, businesses and organisations. Financial damages include VAT, prices of replacing new items, and loss of trade. So we'll be focusing predominantly on economic damages in this study. So what did we do? Well, it's quite an enormous task to undertake a cost estimate. It involves collecting a huge amount of data and it involves QAing a lot of data to make sure that you're using the right data to undertake the cost estimate. So what we do is we split the damages into different damage categories, which are shown in the table on the left-hand side. So we look at households, businesses, temporary shelters, impacts on vehicles, boats, caravans, impacts on local authorities, emergency services, flood risk management assets, utilities, agriculture, education, health, transport, wildlife sites, heritage and tourism. So, and we collect all sorts of different types of data for all of those categories. Some of those categories it's harder to get data than others. And that data can range from really good spatial data that we've obtained from flyovers during the flood events, through to reports and studies undertaken by local authorities, through to information found in newspapers, and we use this range of data to undertake a cost estimate. In terms of the flood data, we're really interested in the types of flooding. Was it fluvial flooding? Was it coastal flooding? Was it groundwater flooding? The location where the flooding took place. The duration of that flood event, because the long duration floods can, in some circumstances, have bigger impacts than those that happen rapidly. The extent of the flooding and the number of times that a particular area was flooded. In 1314, we saw quite a few places, particularly in Kent and in the Thames Valley, where there was repeated flooding. So we wanted to understand whether repeated flooding and long duration flooding incurs greater damages than one-off flooding. We collected a range of sources. We collected top-down national data sets that belonged to government departments, to the insurance industry, and then we collected up a lot of bottom-up data from local authorities and local sources. All of those data sources were pulled together, and we QA'd them to understand which data sources were the most reliable, and we used those data sources to inform flood cost estimates for all of the damage categories which you saw earlier. In summary, what we found was that in 1314 there were £1.3 billion worth of damages in England and Wales. And what we tend to do is we give a range. So we say that the damages range from 1 billion to 1.5 billion. And the reason we give a range is to account for any uncertainties in data. What we found for this series of floods was that residential properties incurred the greatest damages, and that was then followed by businesses. We were able to do some splitting of the data sets to understand whether the impacts were found mainly on the coast or in fluvial locations. So we found a sort of 50-50 breakdown in damages for coast and the fluvial systems. What I'll do now is go into each of the damage categories in a little bit more detail to show you what we found, to give you an idea of the ranges. So for residential property damages, our best estimate was 320 million. And we had some really high quality data sources for our residential damage estimates, so we have quite high confidence in that figure. However, we do have some ranges either side, and that accounts for different data sets that we obtain from our bottom-up and top-down data collection approaches. We also collected information on public health and welfare, temporary accommodation, cars, boats and caravans. Those had a lesser damage estimates than the residential properties. Moving on to businesses and agriculture. Businesses was an impact category which scored quite highly, with a best estimate of 270 million. We also obtained quite useful information and reliable data to enable us to have quite high confidence in that figure for businesses. For agriculture, we found the best estimate of around 19 million. And what was quite interesting about the agricultural damage estimates was that we've seen higher estimates in 2007, and that's partly down to the seasonality of flooding. It tends to be that the higher damage estimates for agricultural damages are found in the summer months when farmers are about to harvest their crops, whereas in this case it was a winter flood, so the damage estimates come out quite a bit lower than those we've seen in 2007. We also looked at the impacts of local authorities and local governments on emergency services and on flood risk management infrastructure. So the local authority and local government figures is looking at the damages that were incurred in each local authority and the money they've had to spend on repairing their infrastructure. What that category doesn't include is the damages to flood risk management infrastructure, which is covered under the bottom category in this slide. We found quite a high figure for flood risk management infrastructure. There was a really detailed scheme to repair assets that were damaged within local authorities and within the Environment Agency, and we had some really reliable information on this, so we're quite confident in the figure for the flood risk management infrastructure of 1.47 million. Our emergency services figures came out quite low, partly because it was a data source that we really found hard to obtain. So we collected some information from the emergency services, but it wasn't something that they routinely collected, so it was hard for us to do a damage estimate, which is why it remains quite low. The transport sector was quite heavily impacted during these flood events. As you probably remember, there was a lot of disruption to the rail network with railway lines collapsing into the sea. There was also some damage felt at some of the ports, particularly during the storm surge on the east coast, and Gatwick Airport and Shoreham Airport suffered some flooding, which led to partial closure. The road networks tend to be affected throughout the whole country, so overall we've seen that for the transport network that the damages that were incurred were similar to those witnessed in 2007, with the highest figures related to the rail and road networks. Under utilities, it wasn't that easy to find information to undertake our flood cost estimate for these two categories. However, compared to 2007, where there was quite substantial impact on the water industry with flooding of water treatment works, that wasn't such an issue in the 13-14 floods. So we used information from water companies and from the energy industry to undertake these flood cost estimates. Some of the categories which tend to score least highly in flood cost estimates are the impacts of floods on wildlife sites, the impacts on tourism and recreation, which can be really hard to estimate, and the impacts on heritage sites. However, we collected some helpful information from Historic England, Natural England, and many non-governmental organisations who manage wildlife sites. However, these figures don't have a huge impact on the overall cost estimate because they remain quite low. Another thing that we were able to do was to try and understand how much of the costs were attributed to fluvial flooding and how much were attributed to coastal flooding. And for each of the damage categories, we were able to split the costs according to whether they were felt by fluvial flooding or coastal flooding. What we found really hard to do and weren't able to do was to understand which impact categories were affected by groundwater flooding. So although we knew which locations in the country had suffered groundwater flooding, it was sometimes very difficult to unpick whether there was a combination of groundwater and fluvial flooding or solely groundwater. So in this study, it was only possible to split it by these two categories. So one thing I get asked quite a lot is how much did this flood cost compared to the 2007 floods, which is always a tricky question to answer because no two flood events are the same, and to some extent it's artificial to compare them. However, this table gives you some interesting insights into the differences in those type of flood events. So one of the really driving figures in the 2007 floods was that 55,000 homes flooded, whereas in 13-14 this was more around the 11,000 mark. And this has quite a big impact on the damage estimates for households. So it is substantially lower this time round. Some other interesting areas are that compared to 2007, the damages to assets seems to be a lot higher, with 147 million spent on asset repair. However, we're not sure whether that is just showing a change in policy, where perhaps all flood risk management organisations have become better at reporting asset damage, and in these most recent floods there's been a very planned programme of asset repair. In terms of impacts on utilities, the utility impacts were a lot less this time round, and we think that's partly due to the fact that there's substantial damages that were seen into the water industry, particularly in the Myve water treatment works, weren't seen this time round, so the figure is much lower. Transport damages are really similar, and perhaps the one that is quite a lot different is the impact on the health. So we have substantially lower figures for the impacts of the floods on health, and we think that is partly due to the fact that to get really reliable data on the impact of floods on health and the social impacts of floods, it can take a long time to collect that data. We were collecting this data approximately 9 months after the 13-14 floods, and whilst no doubt those floods had a substantial impact on people's mental health and their health, the data that we needed to create that flood cost estimate simply is not yet available. So that's why that figure looks quite a lot different. So overall, the flood costs for 13-14 were 1.3 billion compared to 3.9 billion. We think that the driving difference is going to be the impact on households, and that's why those numbers came out substantially less. In terms of the project outputs, what we have is we've produced a one-page infographic, which you can see on the right-hand side of this screen, and that breaks down for each of the impact categories the costs and the range of costs. We also have a non-technical summary document which goes through each of the categories that I've just described and explains the damages and how they were derived. Then we've got a really detailed technical report with method statements for each impact category, which you can delve into if you're interested in the sort of economics behind the cost estimate and understanding how we did it. We've also got an internal tool that we've used called the flood cost calculator, which is a spreadsheet that we can use to do rapid flood cost estimates. And as part of this study, we looked at how that could be updated. So our tool has now been updated as a result of this study, and it's something that we want to use more regularly during floods, so that we can understand the impacts on the economy more rapidly than we have been able to before. All of these outputs have been extensively peer-reviewed by Professor Edmund Penning-Rousel from the Flood Hazard Research Centre, which has been invaluable because he's been involved in many of the past flood cost estimates. In terms of what we're going to do next, well, many of the figures and the unit values from the study can be used by us and the Flood Hazard Research Centre to potentially look at updating the multicoloured manual, which is used across the industry for investment decision making. We'll also be updating our flood cost calculator, and as part of that update process, we're currently using that to look at the costs of the recent 2015-2016 winter floods to understand how much that cost the economy. We're expecting that to be higher than the 13-14 flood cost estimate because the figures for the residential properties flooded is quite a lot higher than that witnessed in this study. We've got some other areas of research that we want to build on. So what we've really struggled with in the past is having a really reliable method for understanding the damages that were avoided through the existence of flood defences. So for our existing defences, when they perform, how much are they protecting people by during an individual flood? So we'd quite like to do more research to look at that. Also, during the time that this study was being undertaken, many universities across the country were involved in research projects to look at the social and health impacts of the floods on communities. And we think the outcomes from those studies could be used to improve the way that we estimate the impacts of floods on communities. Though those studies can be quite long-term because the impacts of floods on people can take quite a while to manifest themselves and can last quite a long time. So those are both areas where we think more research is needed. In terms of where you can get the reports from, you can, if you Google search the cost and impacts of the winter 13-14 floods, that will bring you a link to all of those reports and to the infographic. So those are all freely available on our website. Our flood cost calculator is an internal document only at the moment, but if you want to find out more about that, I can just drop me an email and I can put you in contact with our economists who are working on that at the moment. So that's all I was going to present. So if anyone has got any questions, I believe you can enter that in the comment boxes, and then I will go through those individually and respond to those. So thanks for listening to me. I'm not sure where the comments box is, or if anyone's made any comments. It's not obvious. So if you have got any questions, just drop those in and I'll try and answer those.